Bob Murphy, it's a pleasure to see you on this beautiful Sunday morning. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Always a pleasure.
Well, so you've released this new book on Bitcoin, and it's very exciting. I can't say that I've read the entire thing, but of course we've been through this intellectual journey together. I guess as almost everybody in the Bitcoin space has, but you and I have a special sort of background that makes us both intrigued at this. In the course of researching it, what was your sense of things? Did you learn some new stuff? Is there things in your book you think are particularly notable?
Yeah. So for those hearing this, it's Understanding Bitcoin. If you go to understandingbitcoin.us, you can get the latest version. We'll just keep updating it. And what I did is I grabbed this guy, Silas Barta, who's been kind of hanging around libertarian Austrian circles. I've known him for a while, and I realized he built a mining rig just with off-the-shelf graphics cards and things. And when I really didn't even understand what Bitcoin was, and so I knew he understood the math behind it, and he was also pretty good at using analogies to explain what was going on with mining. And so I realized, okay, I can, if he and I team up, because I wanted to talk about the economics of it, and I realized he could explain. So the point of our guide is to say, look, if you have no math background and you want to read one thing, there's like an introduction to give you enough about the mechanics of it so you can see how it works and then draw your own opinions or conclusions. Because that was, I think you've seen this too, Jeff. People will be arguing about Bitcoin and the implications, and it's clear they don't really know how it even works. Like when Mount Gox happened, for example, I was like, yeah, see, it was supposed to be secure, and it was like, well, yes and no. So I think it's important before people draw conclusions about it to have a basic understanding of how it works, and that's what we try to give in this guide, is just to explain the basic mechanics. You don't have to have any prior math background, and yet I think we give you enough that you really do understand what's going on. And then I try to place it in the context of free market monetary theory.
Right.
And so I think you and I have known Hayek, had his denationalization of money, and so for a while I was thinking in terms of, oh yeah, maybe you could have a fiat money as long as it's privately issued and there's competition, but that still relied on trust, and that's what's so fascinating about Bitcoin is it's this privately produced. You could call it a fiat currency if you want to in that sense, but it's no one's in charge of it, not even one private company, and so it's an interesting thing that certainly Hayekians ought to really study just for its own sake, because it's such an interesting idea.
Well, a lot of times people think they know how it works because they just hear the short version. Oh, here's a digitally created, digitally managed currency. And then your brain turns around and says, oh, well, that can't possibly work. I know that's what happened to me. I mean, that's how I was dismissing Bitcoin in like 2011, and even as early as, even as late as 2012, without really looking into its structure and how it works. And I mean, the first confusion that I overcame was the point about the limits on Bitcoin. I mean, that was the thing that sort of made me realize, okay, I don't understand this,
Right.
And so I threw myself into it. But another major confusion that I always, like almost every speech I talk about this, is how Bitcoin unites currency and payment system. That's something we haven't encountered before.
Right, and that's actually why I think that this has a potential. It's in a sense even a harder currency than even gold or silver would be. I mean, for two reasons. One is, in principle, they could always find more gold or silver, or they could go out and mine it from asteroids or something. So even if the world did embrace and went back to using gold as money, which for a long time I've thought, well, that'd be fantastic. That would be the best thing. In principle, there could still be an inflationary influx that would make gold untenable as the money, whereas with Bitcoin that really can't happen, at least not in that sense, that there is that mathematical limit built into the protocol itself. But then beyond that is what you're bringing up here, and this didn't even hit me until we were writing the last sections of the guide that we wrote, is that because it is married to a payment system, if people used Bitcoin as the money, or some other currency like it, then they would be less reliant on intermediary banks, and so there's less. It'd be more likely that the free market response of bank reserves would be closer to 100%, because in effect, Bitcoin with your own wallet allows you to have your own checking account. And so if you think about, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but in the standard models, like in the free banking literature about privately held, without having a central bank bailing them out or anything, just what's the equilibrium reserve ratio for checking accounts, the more competition you have, the more banks that that you'd think it would end up being higher. And so, in a sense, Bitcoin allows everybody to have his own checking account if he wants to, in terms of your wallet. So I think that there's a lot of reasons that Austrian libertarians in particular, if they haven't really given it a chance, should get into it and don't just take one guy's opinion to say no, don't get into that. That's silly. Like I would recommend learn enough about it so you know how the thing works, because if this does work, it really has tremendous consequences.
Yeah, it does, and I've myself tried to avoid all these kind of detailed arguments about theory that used to consume us, over decades, really, about 100% reserves and monetary equilibrium theory and these kind of things. But they are relevant to some extent. I mean, do you think that within the Bitcoin space we're actually going to see an empirical test of a lot of the issues that have consumed banking theory for the last couple of hundred years? In other words, like, we don't have to sit around and theorize. We could just, watch and see what happens.
Yes, the quick answer is yes. I mean, in the wake of Mt. Gox and some of the other scandals, I mean, there are plenty of Bitcoin exchanges that are holding more than 100% reserves right now. And so, I mean, that's an interesting thing, whereas in the traditional Austrian arguments over free banking, we're talking about, well, what happened in Scotland in the 1800s, and that's kind of what we have to deal with, and people argue about that, and it's, whereas...
And they're always imperfect systems, so you're kind of left to speculate.
Right, whereas now you can see stuff in real time, like you're saying, and we have plenty of evidence, or the arguments over the regression theorem, and I've admitted this to other people before, probably to you too. If you had asked me in 2005, is something like Bitcoin possible, I probably would have said no, because it would never get off the ground. How would anybody know how to value at the beginning? And so, Bitcoin has shown that, there was a way it happened and flourished that I would have not have thought possible. And so we kind of left trying to explain what happened.
But a lot of this is due to the fact that, as a monetary economist, and somebody who's talking about Bitcoin, you only think about it in terms of money. We weren't prepared to think about this in terms of a valuable payment system alongside it. And that's, for me, like, the great lesson I've learned from Bitcoin is don't try to outsmart the market. Even as a theorist, there's things that are possible that you personally can't, imagine. And putting these two things together, the payment system as the use value for money is just, honestly, I don't think, Bob, and I feel like I've read a lot of literature, I don't think anybody fully anticipated something like that. I mean, not even Hayek, where he's spinning out possible scenarios.
Right.
We could have a kind of a new privately produced currency. Nowhere does he say, well, let's just say that the use value of the currency is its capacity to be exchanged itself in a technologically interesting way. I mean, he never said anything remotely like that.
Right. I mean, even in the beginning, when I was first studying Bitcoin, I was just focusing on it as, basically a system of, I mean, even the analogies that I use to try to get it across, I'm just imagining that it's this scarce thing. It's like the community jointly recognizing who owns these abstract but scarce items. And for me, that was the issue, like just the distribution of understanding of who owns what. It was like a system of property titles, because then that could be money. And I didn't really worry so much about how they were exchanged among each other, because, you got to get into the cryptography, and I don't want to get into that yet. Exactly. But, it's neat. You go to the original white paper on it. I mean, the fact that it's a payment system is right in the title. So clearly those two things were married together, in the creators of Bitcoin minds up front. So you're right. I think it's part of the issue is people just want to focus on one little element, and then they just say stuff that people who know more about it realize that no, you don't even, maybe your conclusion's right, but you really don't know what you're talking about. So you got to learn a little bit more before you start shooting off your opinion.
Well, we focus on the thing we know and we care about. This is why the first time I read the white paper, it made no sense to me, like, at all, because I was looking for an explanation of where this money, came from.
Right.
And the white paper just focuses entirely on blockchain technology. And every time I bumped into a word I didn't understand, I would kind of blast by it, So yeah, I mean, for me, in the spring of 2013, I finally just sat down and thought, okay, I'm going to have to read about cryptography. I'm going to have to figure this stuff out. And
Yeah, and like earlier, for example, you asked me, did I learn anything? And yes, in working with Silas on this guy, because he would write sections, I would read them, drafts, and I would say, you know what, I still don't get it, so it's still too hard, and then stuff was just clicking for me, like how mining pools work, or like something that's obvious to people in the area but was new to me was the idea that, well, you're using your private key to digitally authenticate a transfer order that's broadcast to the network. And so, well, gee, if that's like your signature, why couldn't someone just copy it? Like once they see what your signature is, why couldn't some rogue put out a fake order with your signature? And their answer is, well, because the signature itself changes based on the transaction, but only you have the ability to generate it. So it's not like John Hancock in zeros and ones that's the same regardless of the transaction. Your actual unique identifying signature changes and is intrinsically related to the transaction. So someone can't change the numbers a little, the amounts, the Bitcoin amounts, and put your signature, because your signature itself would be different. So just things like that, when you understand it more, you just kind of appreciate that whatever the thing ends up doing down the road, this is just an amazing accomplishment of the human mind. This is just a fascinating idea.
well, and there's other features of Bitcoin's operation that were kind of lost on me for a long time. But one was, like, I didn't understand for a long time that you can have potentially an unlimited number of public addresses associated with a single private key. That was amazing to me, and I only discovered that once Coinbase installed that technology, so that every new transaction, uses a different public address. I didn't get that for a long time. Um, and just the other day, when I was in New Zealand, I had a revelation, because I paid for a helicopter ride with Bitcoin and realized that Bitcoin overcomes the problem of national exchange rates, which, like I didn't entirely understand that either. Like I was converting out of New Zealand dollars into American dollars and into Bitcoin and back again. Then I realized, wait a minute, I'm taking a step that's unnecessary here. There's just a Bitcoin price, and that's it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. As I was thinking more about it, and this really hit me when I went to the Texas Bitcoin conferences. So what was that? Was that 2014 or 13? I'm getting my years mixed up. But that's when it really clicked for me as to why this thing was powerful. As I was just realizing, if you're able to send somebody payment and all you need is to get online, like how much that just connects the world. Because people are like, oh, what are we talking about? I could do that with PayPal or these. Well, no, because if a government leans on PayPal and says we don't want you giving donations to WikiLeaks or whatever, they might back off. And so, but the point is that no, here, if it is this distributed public ledger that there's thousands of copies all over Earth, that there's no one choke point that can be shut down, that even powerful states can't just lean on that one conduit and then make it hard to send payment to people. And once you realize there could be people in some South American country where the soldiers are going around stealing anything of value, and if you can just sell your stuff and get it in terms of bitcoins, you can send it out of the country or have it on a little, something in your pocket or something, or just even you can just remember what your private key is if you have a good memory and you trust. So I mean, it's really amazing the options and the way it allows people around the world to just connect with each other economically once you fully think through the ramifications of what something like Bitcoin allows.
One of the things that I noticed, like at the Texas Bitcoin conference, for example, there's a lot of talk about multi-signatures. I mean, just to kind of give an explanation of that, when Bitcoin first came out, it was just your wallet was just and the ability to use your wallet to enact transactions and things was tied to individual volition, and you couldn't make that contingent upon multi-parties approving that transaction. At least conceptually, it was possible, but it wasn't. We didn't really have the technology even a year ago. Now, most of the major exchanges have very easy interfaces for bringing about multi-signature transactions. So this is important for firms, and it's important for wills and other sorts of things. For me, it's been very interesting to watch how, like, speculations of a year ago are now coming into reality. That's how fast things are moving.
Yeah, and and it was funny. Tatiana Moroz actually was the one who pushed me into going to one of these Bitcoin conferences, and she said, I'm paraphrasing, something to the effect that, these other Liberty type events, people are real depressed and just sitting around and just waiting for the end. Whereas these Bitcoin ones, like people are creative and they're producing things. Like they're all bubbling around saying, "Oh, look at my idea. What if we did it this way?" And I didn't know what she meant at first, but I went and once I got there, I saw what she meant. That these are real creative people who are coming up with what they think can be a solution that helps. And I'm obviously I'm stereotyping here, but it just had a different feel to it compared to other places where sometimes you just get this message that, oh my gosh, the Federal Reserve is unstoppable and the police state's coming, there's nothing we can do, just wait for the end as you go over the waterfall. And so that's also what I like about this, that this gives a new platform and people, it sort of sets them free to go to say, hey, we have this new infrastructure that more and more people are adopting, and what can we do with this? It's like having the internet. Like before, if you just thought the internet was going and looking at what your store has available and then being able to send email to people, and that's what you thought it was, hey, that's kind of neat. And I think that's kind of what Bitcoin is right now, like what we're imagining that it can do for us. And you've done this a lot in your public talks, at least, saying how it's not Bitcoin per se, it's like the blockchain. Like that's really, and you've been focusing how it's a bigger thing. That Bitcoin is just one example in this new genre of ways humans can interact with each other.
Yeah, I mean, just the capacity, and I've tried to explain this to people, the capacity to bundle, commodify, and title information and port it to any other individual user in the world in a way that's time-stamped, non-forgeable, non-repeatable, and verified and guaranteed and basically made permanent is like an awesome thing that you could do. And once you realize that that's the technology, then money, yes, is part of it and integral to it, but it's not the only application. There's so many other applications, and now we're seeing those actually come online. Tell me this. I wonder if you've experienced this too at conferences and things. The real innovators in the space and the code slingers and the people that are really doing a lot of these Bitcoin 2.0 technologies are kind of presuming an atmosphere of total freedom. In other words, their innovations are not like circumscribed by the possibility of regulations and limits. And then at the same conferences, eventually there'll be like a panel on government regulations,
Right.
and it's like brought up as an after effect.
Right. Yeah, and I want to make sure that your listeners recognize, in case they haven't been to these conferences, it's not an ideological thing. I mean, the reason people go to these conferences is because they're interested in Bitcoin. So you'll have people there who, maybe they voted for Obama or something. It's not that they're ideological, but there are people there, and that's part of what we're trying to do with our guide. Is I want to go both ways to explain to people who are interested in libertarian philosophy and that kind of stuff why you should take Bitcoin seriously and look at the impact it could have, but then also to the standard Bitcoin people to get them to realize why are these other groups so interested. Because yeah, these conferences, it seems like there was two groups. Like there's people interested in the commercial application and just the pure coders and so forth, and they were over here in one corner, and then there are people over here who were interested in the implications for human freedom, and a lot of times they couldn't communicate with each other very well. It just on that last point too, you brought up, Jeff, that I noticed that in the finance literature, like the economics, where people have these esoteric modeling, like Fisher Black and guys like that, and a lot of times they just build the model of how financial markets would work without assuming any regulation, because it's pure. You know what I mean? Like it's like you really push this limit or this idea to its limit in that kind of a wind tunnel, and then they go, oh yeah, of course the SEC is going to come in, but I'm talking about this is how the thing would work, and it's
right.
And it's not because they're anarchists. It's just because when you're a scientist or a theorist, you start, from the simple level and build it there, and then throw on the other stuff as an afterthought.
I wonder if you've heard. I bumped into a couple of objections recently to Bitcoin that I thought were fascinating. One was it was in New Zealand. There's a guy who had studied monetary equilibrium theory, and said he didn't think that Bitcoin would actually work as a monetary system because it's not responsive enough to changes in supply and demand for money. And I thought that was, and I think there's an answer to that. Obviously, I think the answer comes from the price itself, right? But which is moves according to changes in supply and demand for money. But I enjoyed the discussion because it was fairly sophisticated critique and illustrates part of the problem that comes from sort of trying to impose a theory on what's basically an emergent technology.
Right, and I agree with you on all the elements of that. That it is interesting that he's applying a fairly high level, subtle critique. But I think you're right. The answer is simply, well, prices adjust, and also too, in the type of world where the majority of humans used Bitcoin or some other type of currency like that, I think prices would be a lot more flexible, right? And so the reason traditionally people worry about, oh, gee, could the purchasing power of money switch enough in case there's a massive change in demand? That's because people say, oh, there's sticky wages and sticky. Well, in a really electronic universe where everything is traded online, or many things are traded, with computers, you would think that prices would be a lot more flexible in that kind of environment anyway. So that fear really doesn't worry me. But on top of that, part of the reason you have these big swings in the demand for money is when there are financial crises or depressions and so forth. And so if the whole world or a large fraction is using something like Bitcoin, you're not going to see that. So you're going to have the long run equilibrium of slow and steady growth, or perhaps rapid and steady growth, is going to be the norm. It's not like there's going to be these wild business cycle swings, at least if the Austrians are right about what causes the business cycle, which we think they are. So I think a lot of it is a worry about, they're looking at what happens with state issued money and all the problems it causes, but that isn't even going to be an issue.
Another funny critique I've heard recently, I like these kind of like higher level critiques, as I'm bored with the people who say it's just a Ponzi scheme or something like that. But it comes from the left, and it's the same criticism that was oftentimes made of the gold standard. In fact, it's a very common criticism of the gold standard, that there's wasted use of resources. Like, why should we go through all this trouble of mining gold, digging it out of mountains,
Right.
porting it here, porting it there? It's much more efficient. It makes a lot more sense just to have a government fiat system so we can save on resource costs. And I've heard that same critique made of Bitcoin. We've got these gigantic server farms all over China and strange places like Iceland, or wherever you can find cheap electricity, that are doing nothing but just like grinding away, confirming transactions and mining Bitcoin. And it seems like a waste, to a constructivist mind who's looking from the outside. They're like, this system is not efficient. Why are we doing this?
Yeah, it is fun, and I saw that in particular from Paul Krugman. That was one of his things, and in his mind, we have perfectly good functioning state-issued fiat currency. Why don't we? Even as he's lamenting how these idiot central bankers and the ECB and the Fed aren't doing what Krugman thinks they need to do to end this depression now. So I mean, even within his own worldview, he has to admit that the incompetence of central bankers is leading to a worldwide depression for years on end. Again, even in his own, we would say the same thing, but we'd flip the causality. But the point is, clearly there are downsides to your approach, and the beauty of this. And the other thing too is, and I've heard people say stuff like, but Bob, as the transactions get larger and larger, I mean, pretty soon we're going to be talking about terabytes of recording. But can you imagine how much memory they're going to have? You know what I mean? Like, this is the advances in computer storage and so forth. I mean, at this point, I go to the karaoke bar, and with my phone, I take little clips of my songs and send them to my dad to say, hey, did I hit that note or not, or what do you think? And I'm sending more information for my stupid karaoke trying a song that's out of my range than probably humanity sent during World War II or something. You know what I mean? It's really, so this idea that that's going to be the constraint, like, oh, we're not going to have enough storage to store all these transactions in 20 years. Come on, that's not going to be an issue. It's going to be a piddly little percentage of humanity's total computational power is to keep this beautiful money in place that facilitates all of our transactions. That's going to be resources well devoted, if you will.
To me, there's also a Hayekian point here too. I mean, no individual mind is likely, or probably cannot, come up with an objection or a problem that's associated with Bitcoin that the crowdsourced information that filters to the core developers, in other words, the market itself, can't come up with. In other words, you can't actually outsmart it. Like, if you can think of a problem, then that problem has already been thought of, most likely.
Right, and that's the beauty of libertarian, theory in general. When people come up with this, oh, we couldn't have private police for, we couldn't have a private military because of this. And it's like, well, you don't think people, if you came up with that, well, so can everybody else, and let's think about that. So and there's also this issue too. It's not as if we're sticking a gun to everyone's head and saying you have to use Bitcoin. I mean, people can still hold gold, and there could still be the gold Bitcoin exchange ratio, and you know what I mean. So it's not as if, oh my gosh, we're all putting our eggs in one basket, and if it blows up in our face, then we're going to have to go back to barter. That's not really the issue. So I do think it's going to happen in practice. More and more people will adopt it, and more, there'll be sort of a reserve asset there. But then eventually, I think, yeah, you're going to see communities where a given person might be able to go through most of his daily transactions just using Bitcoin, or if something replaces it down the road, something like Bitcoin.
Well, let me ask you this, because I think you and I come from the same tradition, the same orientation, just generally. What Bitcoin did for me is it caused me to rethink what money is. Like, I think that I used to have this view that somebody was either money or it was not money, and that like once you jump from one to the other, you've really made this leap, and there's no sort of gray area in between. But as we've watched Bitcoin emerge gradually over the last 5 years, you do see something that's a lot more complicated, where it's not money, and then it becomes a little bit money-like for a handful of people for a certain number of uses. And then that's gradually building up, and like right now, there's plenty of firms out there in the world that are using Bitcoin for accounting purposes, but not that many. And for the most part, the new adoptees are just, accepting Bitcoin as a payment method and converting it immediately to national money. So we've got a ways to go before it becomes like this archetype of, what we call money. So I've had to change my own feeling for what an emergent money looks like and feels like. Did that happen to you also?
It did. You're setting me up beautifully for this, because in the guide, drawing on standard, Mengerian, Misessian monetary theory, it's crystal clear when something is a medium of exchange, right? That you're accepting that thing because you intend to trade it away in the future, not because you're going to use it directly. That's what it is, and that's crystal clear bifurcation. But then Mises says, it's not as obvious when is something a money, and the sort of general definition say, oh, it's a medium of exchange that's generally accepted within a community. And so you're right. I tried to apply that to Bitcoin, and I was like, but wait a minute, because I think they kind of had in the back of their mind, they just assumed that the community was people who are all in geographical proximity. That's because true. There are plenty of people on Earth right now that their number one thing, if you want to pay them, they will say first and foremost, pay me in Bitcoin if you have it. And then if you don't, okay, yeah, I'll accept dollars or euros or gold or whatever. And so there are thousands of people, let's say, who their number one thing, if you're going to try to pay them, they would say, my first choice would be Bitcoin. But yet, does that mean those people all put together Bitcoin is money to them? And in the guide, I made the judgment call and said, not really, because they can't pay their rent in Bitcoin and they can't go get their grocery because they're not, you know what I mean? If it gets to the point where they can just get enough of their economic transactions with other people in that community so they can get through life only buying and selling with Bitcoin, then clearly that's a money. But right now, it's still but there are people who, as almost like a publicity stunt, will go out and try to live a year just using Bitcoin, that kind of stuff.
It's not even a publicity stunt. Last night on Liberty.me, we heard the John Bush's family, the wife, sorry, I can't remember, Patricia, I can't remember her name, but they were, her. They traveled all over the U.S. using Bitcoin, and she talked about just the difficulties here. There's an app called Airbits, I think. Mm-hmm. That's like an around me app for Bitcoin. So, they can find hotels that accept it, they can take flights that accept it, they can get food. But the major problem they faced is getting, and it's not for them, it's not for them just like an intellectual challenge. I mean, this is a family that actually is living off Bitcoin,
Right.
So the big problems they're facing was of all things just getting gas, getting a way to fill up the tank of their car. And that turns out to be the biggest challenge that they face. But as I listened to her talk, I mean, it was intriguing because here you have a family that's been entirely Bitcoinized, mm-hmm. but and a large part of their lives can be can be conducted using Bitcoin, but there's still pockets where it's not working for them, So, but so here you have this emergent quality. I mean, I listened to this thing with just total fascination. I know I go through this myself. Like I try to use Bitcoin for hotels or car rentals or something like that, and I stop after one or two Google searches and a couple of tricks. And I think, well, that's not available. But no, for them, they'll use 4 or 5 apps, and combine all their features to do anything.
And it's an exponential process where it's great that there are people, and I confess, I'm certainly not. I'm still new to using it in my daily life. You know what I'm saying? Like people say to me, "Do you accept Bitcoin?" I said, "Sure thing. Yeah, go ahead. If you want to pay me in Bitcoin, I'm fine to do that." But that's the thing is people don't. In other words, the critics will say, "Oh, come on, these restaurants where they're just accepting it because they know there's a certain demographic that will pay them and they'll attract those people." But they're not hanging on to it. They're immediately cycling it out for dollars or whatever the currency is. But that's all you would need. Just is more and more people, because there are plenty of people who want to use Bitcoin, but they don't because, like you say, they're going to hit all these roadblocks. So the more restaurants, and then if some gas station then start, if Exxon says okay, and select stations on the interstate will take Bitcoin, I mean that all of a sudden will make it more practical, and it's just a snowball effect. So it does take people doing that, and that's why I would encourage people who really believe in it. It actually helps if you go around to your favorite bars or whatever, and you ask the owner, do you accept Bitcoin? Because even if the answer is no, if you're the 10th person that's asked that, the guy might say, maybe I should, and have his staff like, go look into that. Is it a big deal? How would we do that? And so it's the kind of thing where everyone would start using it if everyone's using it.
And you know what's funny? When you go back and read Principles of Economics by Menger and actually read his story about where money comes from, what you're seeing take place right now is not inconsistent. I mean, he describes a process of discovery, experimentation, and unfolding knowledge that can last decades and decades or longer before something becomes this this final product of this thing that we call money. But there's a lot of stages in between. And it's nice. In other words, money emerges. What you get from that Menger story is that money emerges the same way any other product in the market, emerges through experimentation, entrepreneurship, and trial and error, and a gradual unfolding of practice.
And that's what I'm trying to do, incidentally, with this guide that we wrote, is because, like, we all know the story about what are the qualities of gold and silver? How come they became the market's money of choice? It's because they're divisible, and gold is gold, whereas like 2 diamonds of comparable weight, like if you have one huge diamond that weighs a pound and 10 smaller diamonds that collectively weigh a pound, those aren't the same thing. Whereas an ounce of gold is an ounce of gold, that kind of stuff. But if that weren't obvious to people, like if you really needed to be trained in metallurgy or something to really understand how gold even worked physically as an element, well, then maybe it would have taken longer for gold to catch on. So the insiders would have realized this yellow metal is a wonderful money, but if they couldn't get their fellow man to realize that, well, then maybe gold wouldn't have become the money. So that's trying what we're doing. Like when we recognize how great it would be if lots of people that accepted Bitcoin as payment, then that's why part of why we want to evangelize and just make sure people realize, do you see how this thing works? Is because I think a lot of people don't accept it right now because they really just don't understand it.
I was talking with a guy who spent a couple of years in prison, and I asked him, I said, I'm so interested in the many things, but I'm especially interested in what your money was. And he said to me, that's easy, ramen noodles.
I could see that.
Yeah, and so it became, the medium of exchange in jail. This is like now,
Right.
People have to have a medium of exchange. When one doesn't work that well, then another one comes along, and it's beautiful because I didn't entirely understand this. I always thought we'd have to have a top-down reform, and now we see the reform happening. By the way, this reform doesn't just affect money, although that's what's interesting to you and me. But from a payment point of view, I mean, the inefficiencies associated with credit cards. I got a call the other day. There's credit card fraud. This is like the 6th time this has happened to me. My card number was phished from somewhere, some public internet probably, and that somebody attempted to use it for something that that my profile at Visa said that it's not the kind of thing I would normally buy, and they refused the transaction, called me up, canceled my card, and I said, my God, how often does this happen to you, to the woman? And she said, look, from the very early morning till I clock out, this is all I do, and I've never seen anything like this. The amount of fraud that's out there, and the amount of specialized knowledge. I mean, can you imagine how much specialized knowledge Visa has to have about you and your spending habits to be able to discern the difference between something you would buy or something you would not buy?
Right.
And this wasn't an obvious thing at all. It was an attempted charge at a big box kind of a combination grocery and hardware store, and they just recognized that that's not the kind of thing I would do. I'm looking forward to an end to that kind of system, which is so full of fallibility, and we're all just so dependent upon these institutions and the tens and really hundreds of billions of dollars they spend trying to protect against fraud. To me, the whole system is just like crying out for another technology to replace it.
Right. And what I didn't appreciate until my business partner and I have an annual event in Nashville, and we have to sell tickets and whatever and take that in, and everyone wants to do everything online now, and so of course people want to pay with their credit card. That's just what everybody does when you order something online. And so that's a process. If you've never been on the merchant end of that, to set that up and to get authorized.net to go through, I mean, it's a process, and they keep a big fraction of it. Now I understand why when you're getting in the cab and you said you take credit cards, the guy will often sigh, and that's because the Visa or whoever gets a cut of it, which you don't, as a consumer, you're thinking, what, I'm paying you, what do you care? But no, they take a big cut. Like we sell books or whatever at our event, we have to tell the authors beforehand, for credit card payments, don't think you're getting the full cover price of your book because we got to send this much. So, and then when I talk to some people who are interested in Bitcoin, that's the thing that fascinates. They don't care about inflation or whatever, because they don't even know that stuff. They don't know Austrian theory, or they don't care about the business cycle. They just care about, man, these big financial institutions, these middlemen are just earning so much money off of these transaction fees. Wouldn't it be great to kind of cut them out and just do it peer-to-peer?
Oh, it's amazing. There was a transaction on the block. I don't know how often you watch the blockchain. It's so fun. I love to watch it in real time. One of the things I do when I talk is I will actually show a live real-time graphic of blockchain transactions taking place as a way of underscoring the point that whatever I say here and whatever you're thinking probably doesn't matter because this is taking place anyway, But there was a transaction that came over the other day for $80 million.
I heard about that.
Yeah, and it cost 4 cents to transact.
That wasn't your helicopter ride, right?
No, that would have had to buy a whole fleet of helicopters. Nobody really knows what the transaction was. I mean, I think there's a presumption that it must have been some exchange moving money from one wallet to another, something like that. But
and that's what's so fascinating too, is that beautifully crystallizes the issue of like a public ledger, but yet pseudo anonymity, that we can all be aware that this thing happened, but we don't know what it was. I love that. It's such a neat thing.
Hey, listen, you and I were dangerous on this topic, and we need to call a stop to this. But in my new book, Bit by Bit, what it attempts to do is characterize Bitcoin as probably the most impressive application of a more general issue of peer-to-peer technology and distributed networks and open source programming development and these kinds of things that are driving forward a whole series of changes. Have you reflected that much on whether and to what extent these new technologies are posing some kind of fundamental challenge to our traditional, very strict divisions between public and private property? Like we've always thought about private property as being things you hold,
right,
and then public property as being probably state-owned, and maybe there's such a thing as the commons, but that comes about in a rare cases through public agreement or something like that. But now you have these distributed networks that are sort of owned by everybody and nobody and everybody. It's all. I mean, does it play with you? Does it do
yes.
mental on you?
And it's I'm not just buttering you up here. It really did. That idea came because you gave a talk one time, and you were saying something like, you were referencing the gospel, like when Jesus fed 5,000 people or whatever, and you were saying, why is that a miracle? Because he took some scarce physical thing like bread and copied it and fed, and you were saying, but when it comes to electronic information, digital information, that we have that access to that, where by making copies of it, you're not taking away from the first person, and that really has set me down this. And the same thing here, that I think you're right, that I almost wonder if the stuff that traditional leftists worry about, like, you guys are so greedy, you capitalists, building fences around and keep people off my land, this is mine, and you're so greedy and grasping. We can sympathize with them when it comes to so-called intellectual property. Like, you can understand how, no, don't you get it, man? Like, don't try to hold on to your song or your novel. Let the world have it, and you'll end up richer.
Yeah, right,
so
right.
It's kind of like, I think there is that issue. So again, I don't want people to misunderstand me. I'm not saying property rights aren't important or whatever, but I'm just saying I think that issue, that like when you change your mentality and just try to give stuff to the world, that in the long run is going to make you wealthier, even measured materially, because it's that there's so much that could be created once we unleash people and allow them just to be productive and to create things. It's not going to be an issue of feeding billions of people. That's going to be nothing. I mean, that what this earth is capable of giving people when they unleash their creativity. And I think things like Bitcoin and what have you, like just this new intellectual application or way of humans of interacting with each other, we're just scratching the surface of it. And
Yeah.
like, one analogy I use is to say, when people go into a restaurant right now and they order water, it's free. It's not because technically it's free, but it's just because that's nothing. Whereas maybe 100 years ago or so, or like if you're in the middle of a desert and that's all we knew was living in a desert, and someone said water should be free, you'd say, you socialist, you Marxist. But in the capitalist modern world, water basically is free in certain. You get what I'm saying? So I think it's that kind of thing, that we're so rich that a lot of what traditional leftists want would be fine. But again, on the other hand, like the people who believe in property rights are also correct to say, well, no, there has to be. Right. But don't you understand? If you just would stop stealing from people through the state, we would have so much abundance that there wouldn't be homeless people and blah blah blah. So.
Yeah, it's a little mystifying, and it's going to take me a while. Even though I've finished the book, and it's going to print, I guess, next week. I'm not sure that I'm really prepared to fully understand the implications of all these things. But that's great, I mean, one of the things that's really cool about being a libertarian, in this idea space, is that you eventually realize that society is smarter than you.
Right.
That crowdsourced information is always going to beat even the most genius individual brain in terms of understanding the potential of the material world.
Right, because we're part of the group. You know what I mean? It's not a matter of are these people over here smarter than you? It's, are you plus the group smarter than you alone? Well, of course you are. Any great idea you have can go into the mix.
Right, and it's a little bit humbling, but in a good kind of way. So I've been reading a lot of Hayek. In fact, a lot of the things I used to read in Hayek that I couldn't really understand are now making sense to me for the first time.
Yeah. It's I have had the same thing, that it's the spontaneous order and all this stuff, and just drawing on the dispersed, localized knowledge, and you really see that all these people coming together, like at a Bitcoin conference, and people have their own. Because, like I said, I was sitting back there as an economist and a watcher of states and the kind of stuff they do, and I realized, holy cow, if this thing took off, do you know the implications? Whereas the other guy who just cares about cryptography, he doesn't even know, he's like, no, don't you see how neat this is? And I don't even know what he's talking about. But
there was a funny moment that happened, I guess it was the last Freedom Fest. I was on a panel with George Gilder, and the moderator of the panel wanted to know who understands Bitcoin. So she said, who here understands Bitcoin? A ton of hands went up. And then she said, who here does not understand Bitcoin? And some hands went up, but one of those hands was George Gilder.
Yeah.
On the panel with him. Now, he's got a big book coming out on the subject, and I'm telling you, if anybody understands Bitcoin, it's George Gilder. But his point of putting up his hand was that, like, no, Bitcoin is bigger than me. It's more brilliant than I am, and there's no amount of understanding I could ever acquire that could compare to the knowledge embedded in this emergent technology now and in the future. I thought that was like, I don't know if anybody else saw that happen, but I thought it was a beautiful symbol.
Yeah, I was actually in the crowd there, and I did notice that, and I thought that was a good.
Yeah.
And also to give courage to people to raise their hands too. I think that's good when you admit.
Well, I felt bad afterwards that I didn't raise my hand. I was like, oh, God, here I am, acting like I know everything. George Gilder's over here going, I don't know anything. But Bob, I won't take any more of your time. Really a pleasure to talk to you. And people can download your book for free, which is just beautiful. My book is coming out in probably, I don't know, 10 days or something like that. And unfortunately, it's not for free, but you can get it on Amazon. This podcast is for free. So
yeah,
that
again, it's thank you, and it's understandingbitcoin.us is where we'll have the latest version at any given time.
Yeah, and I'll customize the YouTube once
Okay.
we finish and put the link out there. Thanks, Bob. Wonderful to visit.
Thanks, good luck with everything.
All right. Thanks. Bob Murphy, it's a pleasure to see you on this beautiful Sunday morning. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Always a pleasure.
Well, so you've released this new book on Bitcoin, and it's very exciting. I can't say that I've read the entire thing, but of course we've been through this intellectual journey together. I guess as almost everybody in the Bitcoin space has, but you and I have a special sort of background that makes us both intrigued at this. In the course of researching it, what was your sense of things? Did you learn some new stuff? Is there things in your book you think are particularly notable?
Yeah. So for those hearing this, it's Understanding Bitcoin. If you go to understandingbitcoin.us, you can get the latest version. We'll just keep updating it. And what I did is I grabbed this guy, Silas Barta, who's been kind of hanging around libertarian Austrian circles. I've known him for a while, and I realized he built a mining rig just with off-the-shelf graphics cards and things. And what I really didn't even understand
was the point about the limits on Bitcoin. I mean, that was the thing that sort of made me realize, okay, I don't understand this,
Right.
And so I threw myself into it. But another major confusion that I always like, almost every speech I talk about this, is how Bitcoin unites currency and payment system. That's something we haven't encountered before.
Right, and that's actually why I think that this has a potential. It's in a sense even a harder currency than even gold or silver would be. I mean, for two reasons. One is, in principle, they could always find more gold or silver, or they could go out and mine it from asteroids or something. So even if the world did embrace and went back to using gold as money, which for a long time I've thought, well, that'd be fantastic. That would be the best thing. In principle, there could still be an inflationary influx that would make gold untenable as the money, whereas with Bitcoin that really can't happen, at least not in that sense, that there is that mathematical limit built into the protocol itself. But then beyond that is what you're bringing up here, and this didn't even hit me until we were writing the last sections of the understand what Bitcoin was. And so I knew he understood the math behind it, and he was also pretty good at using analogies to explain what was going on with mining. And so I realized, okay, I can, if he and I team up, because I wanted to talk about the economics of it, and I realized he could explain. So the point of our guide is to say, look, if you have no math background and you want to read one thing, there's like an introduction to give you enough about the mechanics of it so you can see how it works and then draw your own opinions or conclusions. Because that was, I think you've seen this too, Jeff. People will be arguing about Bitcoin and the implications, and it's clear they don't really know how it even works. Like when Mt. Gox happened, for example, I was like, yeah, see, it was supposed to be secure, and it was like, well, yes and no. So I think it's important before people draw conclusions about it to have a basic understanding of how it works, and that's what we try to give in this guide, is just to explain the basic mechanics. You don't have to have any prior math background, and yet I think we give you enough that you really do understand what's going on. And then I try to place it in the context of free market monetary guide that we wrote, is that because it is married to a payment system, if people used Bitcoin as the money, or some other currency like it, then they would be less reliant on intermediary banks, and so it'd be more likely that the free market response of bank reserves would be closer to 100%, because in effect, Bitcoin with your own wallet allows you to have your own checking account. And so if you think about, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but in the standard models, like in the free banking literature about privately held, without having a central bank bailing them out or anything, just what's the equilibrium reserve ratio for checking accounts, the more competition you have, the more banks that that you think it would end up being higher. And so, in a sense, Bitcoin allows everybody to have his own checking account if he wants to, in terms of your wallet. So I think that there's a lot of reasons that Austrian libertarians in particular, if they haven't really given it a chance, should get into it and don't just take one guy's opinion to say no, don't get into that. That's silly. Like, you should theory.
Right.
And so I think you and I have known Hayek, had his denationalization of money, and so for a while I was thinking in terms of, oh yeah, maybe you could have a fiat money as long as it's privately issued and there's competition, but that still relied on trust, and that's what's so fascinating about Bitcoin is it's this privately produced. You could call it a fiat currency if you want to in that sense, but it's no one's in charge of it, not even one private company, and so it's an interesting thing that certainly Hayekians ought to really study just for its own sake, because it's such an interesting idea.
Well, a lot of times people think they know how it works because they just hear the short version. Oh, here's a digitally created, digitally managed currency, and then your brain turns around and says, oh, well, that can't possibly work. I know that's what happened to me. I mean, that's how I was dismissing Bitcoin in like 2011, and even as early as even as late as 2012, without really looking into its structure and how it works. And I mean, the first confusion that I